All right, hello. Welcome back. So, today we are talking about modeling decision making, rule based systems, and state spaces. Now, this is a lot of concepts, but they all kind of interleave together quite nicely. And yeah, let's get to it. So, click, there we go. First question is to sort of set the stage with what we're even talking about. How is a decision made? That seems trivial almost, as with so many things in cognitive science. You're like, well, I just make a decision. I don't know. But, for example, when the crosswalk is flashing with the countdown, right? It's got the hand that says no and the numbers that are counting down to. Eventually, it will be just a solid red. So you're standing on the corner and you look up from your phone and you see this crosswalk is counting down. The question is, do you step off the curb to beat the light and race the countdown? Or do you wait for the next cycle? By the way, these are AI images. Both of them are a little off. I don't think people should stand in the street in that way, maybe, when they're waiting for a crosswalk. But point is, you must choose between these scenarios, right? They are both things that can happen, and even you just standing still is still you deciding, right? Your neurons are taking in the world, and output is one of two things. So the question is, how is this decision made? And the main kind of idea, I think, is that you have to take in various pieces of information and somehow integrate them, right? So first question is like, how busy is the street? If there's a ton of cars, that's a different scenario than if it's completely empty. Is there some reason to hurry? Are you really trying to get somewhere in time for something, or do you have time to spare? How are you today? You feeling sleepy? Has your coffee not yet kicked in? Speaking of coffee. There's a lot of possibilities there. And all of them can come together to weigh in on this decision, right? Because you don't want to do something that's going to put you in danger, but you also don't necessarily want to wait around for no reason, right? So this is the crux of all decision making is in this way. It's this capacity. So other thoughts that kind of enter the picture here, other decisions you might make every day, right? What am I going to eat for breakfast? Even if you get the same thing every day, you know there's a ton of options out there. I mean, you could break from tradition and go get an orange or go get your favorite cereal. What route am I going to take to class? What route am I going to take to work? Yep, there might be a basic one that I would almost always take, but there's many routes, infinite routes almost, if you count walking back and forth on the same street a route. What should I prioritize today if I'm trying to get things done? What should I purchase? Which thing should I purchase? Oh, you ever try to buy like an air fryer? You'll spend years looking at like, I don't know, what's the difference between this bucket air fryer and this bucket air fryer? And there's tons of data, and it's overwhelming, and it's too much. But eventually, you still make the decision. Either this one, that one, or don't purchase at all, right? Should I go to bed? Am I feeling sleepy, or do I want to keep playing this game? What do I want to do with my time, right? So you are always deciding. That's the key here. You're always deciding because even inaction is a decision. This is a core concept here, because I think it's easy to think about decisions as like this active thing, but the fact is you are in some state of the world and you will be in a different state soon. Sometimes waiting will put you in a different state regardless, right? So this we arrive at this cognitive phenomenon of decision making. It's this core element of any cognitive system, and some even argue that it's the primary role of the brain. This is the crux of what behavior is. It's deciding your way through many spaces. Now, how you slice that up and what you label it is, again, all over the place. But thinking of this as terms of like the function of why have a brain. at all, right? If I'm just like a little sea anemone and I can anchor onto a spot and just absorb nutrients and live, then I don't really need a brain, right? But if I have any amount of complexity in my environment, I do, right? So I need to absorb information. I need to be able to predict possible future outcomes and then use those predictions to help guide my behavior and principally my survival. That's what all biology is concerned with, right? So, and again, why would nature waste the energy evolving a brain if there's no need for a decision, right? So, adjusting some things. A nice example is take us back to our roots. I'm in the woods, and I live there, and I am foraging for berries, things to eat, not just berries, but like anything available in my environment to eat. But it's getting dark, so this is a scenario where there is genuine concern, right? There is genuine danger available in the environment, and you have a lot of variables to weigh. How many berries could I gather before it actually gets dark and I can't gather anymore, and I'm vulnerable to predators? How many people do I know who've been injured by staying out after dark? That would be a piece of the information available in your system to help you make this decision. If you knew a bunch of people who that happened to, you might be hesitant to stay out in the dark. If you don't know anybody, that wouldn't weigh in, right? How many minutes do I have left until it's actually dark? So there's a million ways to slice up the information in the world to make it useful for decision making. But at the end of the day, you either did or did not stay and get those berries. So this brings us to a space where we should talk about state spaces. So this is the first kind of abstraction. It's a model in its way of worlds, of situations, right? So most situations we find ourselves in can be cast in terms of states that change over time. So what's my current state? My body, my mind, my surroundings, where am I located? Again, how tired am I? How many berries do I have at home? These are all things that can enter into your state. So for example, location. You can really only be in one place at a time, so it's fairly easy to model the state space of locations. So home is a place, right? We have the park and we have the grocery store. These are three different states. Now, how you slice up the state space, again, we'll get into that shortly, but the concept here is there are at least three states that I can be in terms of my location. And, we can transition between the available locations using transitions, using actions, right? So the state space of available locations might be, everywhere in your town or everywhere on Earth or everywhere in the universe. We define this. But those transitions can have things like costs. So, for example, from home to the park, there's this nice mutual walking path. From the park to the grocery store, you might have to use the subway, right? And then from grocery to home, you might have the same route, but two different costs. You have the bike trail, and it's uphill. So you might be, from home to the grocery store, it might be easy, going downhill. But from the grocery store to home, it might be an uphill cost, right? So what we're doing here is we are casting a real life situation where you are a person in the world, and we are saying, well, wait, I can represent this with three categories, three states, and then transitions between those states. This is super useful because, remember, getting things into a workable, useful, small-scale form is modeling, and models are useful. They're informationally useful. So, we can draw a distinction between finite states and continuous states. So, finite states imply meaningful categories representing a state. So like we just had with home, park, and other place. But you could also cast that as a continuous state, which would be like your GPS coordinates, right? The numerical way of representing where I am that maybe doesn't have quite as clean of a nominal representation. So a good example of this would be temperature. We might define a finite set of meaningful states. Well, okay, the continuous part I had pop up first, which is easy, right? What degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius are we at? But we also might casually cast regions of that as warm, hot, and cold, right? And hot can be cooled down to warm. Warm can be warmed up to hot. Warm can be chilled down to cool. Cold can be rewarmed to warm, etc. I cast both of these side by side just so it's clear that states, that they're loose. Networks like this, they have nodes and they have transitions. It doesn't really matter how they're arranged. But these are two different ways of considering temperature as a state that we possess. We tend to think broadly with the simplified versions of the finite states, right? We have, I'm feeling really hot. I don't say, I'm feeling 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That's unwieldy. That's hard for a person to tap into, Yeah. So this is the concept of defining states in a finite way or in sort of a continuous way. So transitions, back to transitions, right? We talked about the bike path idea. To get from one state to another state, right? We use transitions. Most often these are actions. To get myself from home to work, I can use walk, the action walk, right? And the full possible state space, the full set of all possible states in an environment and the transitions between them is known as a phase space. So it kind of represents everywhere you can be in the space as well as every direction you can go. All the paths, what is possible in the space. This phase space concept is sort of like, in the way that I have defined the state space, this is all possible action in the state space. You won't always use phase spaces, but it's good to know that that's the concept, right? So, and they aren't necessarily finite. You can have paths, like I was alluding to before. Hot to warm is just as valid as hot to warm, right? So a phase space is not necessarily limited to things that are useful. It's all possible movements. So let's point around here. So from hot, if my ideal state is warm, I might find myself feeling quite hot, especially if I went out and took a walk in the sun. I gradually convert myself to hot. Okay, so how do I get out of hot? There's the slower way, but there's also a more direct way of just apply an ice pack, get me back to warm, right? But then I might go out in a different time of year and go walk in the snow, and now I've gotten myself all cold. How do I feel? Well, grab a blanket and go sit by the heater and go back to warm, right? You're starting to see now maybe why this is kind of useful for decision making, right? If I find myself in a state that I don't super want to be in, then I can transition to a new state. So, yeah, okay. So a quick aside, is the real world a state space? And the answer is sure, yes. But the real world also has this near infinite complexity depth. This might become a little overwhelming here, but just try bear with me. I'll use the mouse. So the question can be, this comes down to, how are we defining our state spaces? Is my yard the same location, state, as my home? How about my block? What about the atoms in my basement? If I have those in hand, right? Is the grocery store that's close enough to walk to, is that part of my home? Probably not, but we're seeing where it's sort of arbitrary, right? Like what does the state of being at home actually mean, right? So this is what, again, we're back to modeling, right? We're taking this infinitely complex thing and we are modeling it down into a wieldable state space, right? Since we are reducing the complexity of the world to make sense of it as a useful little representation here. So what the way that you model these things is like, what do we consider distinct states? Like my location could be a home. what continuous variables are relevant to whatever state we are trying to incorporate, to model in the decision-making processes that we're concerned with. So like hunger could be a 0.7. I don't know, that I'm arbitrarily saying like between 0 and 1, my hunger might be a 0.7, meaning I could eat, you know. And then what constitutes actions, you know, and this one's kind of important for when we think about what state spaces we're looking at in terms of decision making, because are we trying to model individual footsteps, or are we trying to model like I got to the store, or are we trying to model I successfully completed my store task with, you know, buying groceries or whatever. And these are all decisions, right? These are all abstractions that you'll make when you are trying to consider what decisions are being made. So modelers, you setting up an environment in state space, want to examine these things. And even during your normal human day, you also, like I said before, you tend to do some amount of reducing into things that sort of make sense. Like, oh, I feel hot, right? Again, you're not measuring your temperature all day. You're just sort of getting into a category that's like, oh, my hot symbol is activating. Yeah, so that's the world. Let's get out of this infinite zoom. Okay, so this is the concept of state spaces. We're talking about this sort of these directional graphs, right? Yeah. Quick pause. And back. Okay, so one sort of direct way to consider, like, how do you navigate a state space, right? You may have heard of finite state machines or finite state automata. These are essentially systems designed around this basic state space concept. And the easiest way to think of this is you've seen them in any video game you've ever interacted with, is using a state machine under the hood, right? The whole app is running all the time, right? But the first thing you see when you load up a game is a splash screen, right? And that splash screen is like, who developed it? Blah, blah, blah. That just happens compulsorily. But you might be able to tap a button. That's an action. That action takes you now to the title screen. New state. Any environment of a game world that is distinct from the others is likely using a state variable to transition between possible states, right? So you got the title, you've got your gameplay, the pause menu, save menu, whatever, however many different kinds of menus there are. These are all represented in state. Also, the AIs in these games, historically, now many varieties of AI have evolved, but from the core, they always used a lot of state stuff. It's like, oh, my health is low, I will enter a repair heal state. Oh, the player is nearby, but I haven't engaged yet. I'll enter a hiding state, which defines a whole set of behaviors for going and hiding. Yeah, so let's see, what's my next figure? Oh, here's a simple one. This finite state automaton represents the state of a subway turnstile. There are two states. Well, there's an entry point, right? When you walk up to it, it's locked, right? And there are two states the turnstile can be in, locked or unlocked. You have two actions that you can take. You have push or coin. If you try to push a locked turnstile, you're right back where you started. You have changed nothing. No, you have not transitioned state. You have just pushed right back to where you started because it doesn't move. Now you put coin in, you have now changed the state. You have transitioned to an unlocked state in that turnstile. Now, once it's unlocked, you could just keep dumping coins into it, but that won't really change anything. It will still be just as unlocked as it was before. Once it's unlocked, you can give it a push. Now, it will let you through, but it also changes the state back to locked. This is extremely dumb. This is the simplest version of a state machine, but I think it does a great job of illustrating the base case. And we've seen some other examples through the slides already. So the core idea here is that once you've defined a state space, it becomes an extremely useful tool for planning out actions, right? If you have knowledge of these states and all the transitions between them, then you can look forward at potential options. You could define chess behavior in this way, right? It's even true of language. We'll get to that in a second. To flash back to an intro to COG fella, who remembers Shaky? Shaky is the robot that was able to plan and execute behaviors in an environment, in a physical environment. And it used this kind of mapping. Now this is mapping for our benefit, where things are, spatially laid out, but internally it's using a state space transition. It knows where box elements are. It knows where it can be relevant to those. It knows which rooms things are attached to. You could represent this map as a series of states and different elements in different states. And that's how Shaky did it. It would plan out ways to turn on light switches in rooms and whatever, using this kind of logic, and using these kinds of state transition machines. Let's get into grammar, like I was just mentioning. So FSMs, FSAs can help us understand the grammatical structure of language too. So we'll talk about the bottom stuff in a minute. So when we are producing language, we are producing it in a grammatical way. The syntax makes sense to us, right? And one of the theories is that we just hear lots of words, lots of sentences, and we start to abstract, you start to learn what part of the sentence is dog. Well, that's a noun for sure. Mice is a noun, tiger is a noun, dogs is a noun, black cat. Okay, so black is an adjective, cat is a noun. You start to learn those parts of speech, and then you start to learn how they are connected in terms of what is and is not valid to follow what, right? So every, that would be a determiner. Dog, that takes us right to, no. Oh yeah, okay. Here's the transition. Every, that's a determiner. It's telling us like which, right? Okay, so we're at this spot. Noun, okay, dog, great. Now we have some kind of transitive verb, cool. And now we have mice, great. We get to the end. We have successfully, using speech, or whilst producing speech or reading speech, we have traversed a finite state machine. Not machine, right? But like a finite state tree, a finite state transition graph, to get to, hey, that was grammatical. You can imagine, imagine if it said every dog eats don't. Every dog eats error, right? You fail out. And that's how this is the theory, is how we fail out, is that these kinds of structures you'll fail off if you make the errors. So the determiner, sad. Okay, so we've found ourselves in an adjective here, so we got to go up. Tiger saw dogs. Great. Some, short. Black, so we get short and black, that's two adjectives. Cat hears mice. Done. Getting it? So from any given state, and in the case of language, that is recently produced word / token, there are only so many valid options to move forward. Now, recall, obviously, this linguistics people don't get too upset. Obviously, this is one of many, right? This is a very simplified tree. There's lots of ways to produce language, but they all can take on this shape when we're talking about grammar. So there's only so many valid options, and then otherwise, if we error out, we know that this is ungrammatical. It's lost its syntax, and the meaning becomes jumbled. It's thought that these kinds of informational structures are in there, in our brains, but obviously many of these things were years off from pinpointing anywhere specifically in the brain that they exist. But it's a useful abstraction, and there's no reason to think that you can't represent some version of this in neurons. That's one of the guiding principles of computational cognitive modeling, right? So that's the concept behind simple automata that are able to navigate spaces that are like very constrained and very well defined, and there's only so many valid options, and I can move between them. That's grammar, that's shaky, that's video games, that's turnstiles, right? Which is great. But the real trick here is that it's great when things are clear, right? Home, park, and grocery, location is all mutually exclusive. It's easy to define a state space when you can't be in multiple states at once. I can't physically be in two places. But location is just one of many variables. So I can be hungry anywhere I want. I can be tired working, sprinting. I can have no money or tons of money. I can be many things at the same time. I possess many, many, many states at the same time. Now, individual variable state versus like my whole state, it's all kind of definable at whatever level you need to. But the point is, we do need something that's a little more forgiving and adaptable to account for many, many possible states. So, enter production rules. These, hang on. Okay, my bad. Just checking something. Production rules. Okay, so we talked about FSAs, how they represent a way of capturing the implicit rules of behavior transitioning between states in a system, and the paths that can and often must be followed, as well as this was great for systems where flow of information is like very obvious and enforced. But when situations are complex, there's a lot of possible transitions between states. In fact, in reality, there's kind of infinite possible transitions between states. There are many, 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 many ways that I can go to the grocery store right now. And I could become overwhelmed by measuring all of them. Point is, there's a smarter mechanism. And when I say smarter, I mean it precisely. Like it is more in tuned with learning about your environment, and more, parsimonious with actual goals, which is using production rules. A production rule is a way of combining various pieces of state information from the world to give us guidance on what we should do in a given situation. It still deals in states, both continuous and finite. You can use both, and actions, but it can do kind of several at once, right? And on top of that, there's different possible rules can apply at the same time, so you can also, end up coming to a cost evaluation. Like, okay, this thought has me wanting to step off the curb, and this thought has me wanting to stay. I should measure between them. I should do some evaluation between which ones I want to use. So with enough production rules built for a complex scenario, a system can behave pretty intelligently. This is kind of the underpinnings of Act R, which we'll touch on again momentarily. Okay, so production rules. Back to the hunter-gatherer situation, right? We're trying to get berries. What overall happens here? There are many moving parts, right? What time is it? How much can I carry? Are there predators nearby? How well stocked are we at home? How's the weather right now? Like, is it starting to rain, or are we still good? And even more critically, in the state space, nearly everything is a valid action. I can run into the woods to the right, and not gather any berries. I can do a cartwheel into the woods to the left. I have infinite possible actions in a real world scenario. It's not as clean as a turnstile. So we can recruit this idea of production rules. Essentially, it's like, in terms of the logical flow, it's really just a gigantic if statement, but it has to do with if, like, branching logic in very specific kinds of states. So if the state of the world is this way, the world being both the outside world but also me internally and my body, then take these actions, hopefully, that benefit me. The key, like, value of framing decision making in terms of production rules is that they're a way to include lots of different possible variables and, like, combinations of variables, so you can really capture the full space, right? And you can capture, like, edge cases, like, well, under these conditions I might break all my other rules because there's a specific synergy that works really well. And that would come out when you were trying to assess things like, oops, cost, back, no, oh no, slideshow, no, hang on, I've ruined my whole situation. Just get presenter view back on. Boop. How do you go back? Is it backspace? There we go. Okay, where was I? So you can include as many variables about the state of the world as you want. Right. So that's super useful, right? It's not, measuring against a single possible, like, small list of valid options. It's saying there's many things we can ask about the world that will help us make decisions. And we can compute costs, which we'll get into a little more, but this helps us to kind of figure out, when should I listen to one of my rules over another? And ways you could calculate costs that are sort of intuitive are, like, especially in this berry gathering scenario, how many calories is this going to take? Or, in the modern world, how much money is this going to take? Will this further my goals or will it set me back? Overall, is this option worth it? And that's, again, how we get into weighing evidence and state situations and saying, what should I do next? Okay, so ACT-R, talked about in the past. It's the cognitive modeling system where, it's interacting with all of its own modules and connected pieces, and in the core of it, you are trying to model these production rules, right? So let's write some production rules for berry gathering. Normal gathering behavior. Right? Say I'm just standing there in the woods and it's the sun is above some numerical abstraction of 50%, meaning I've got about half the day left, right? Daylight. And my berries are less than maximum. I have less than the maximum number of berries that I can, like, handle in my satchels. So, under these conditions, these normal conditions where the sun's good and I still have room, I'll just keep requesting from my motor system, let's go gather berries. Let's gather berries. Cool. All day. However, at a certain point, the sun gets to a point where we might want to start considering things differently. Now we'll use two different production rules. Here's one for sun low, few berries. If the sun is below 50% and it's starting to get, we might be losing daylight, and I really have, like, not a whole lot of berries. I have less than 40% of my capacity. Under this condition, I'll probably stay out and keep gathering. Even though the sun is starting to go down, I am still assessing, berries are important to my survival. Then there's sun low, plenty berries. This is, the sun's low, but I've got more than 40%. I mean, I can find something else to do at home, right? I live in some wood cave, whatever. And so under these conditions, the sun is low and the berries are, we have kind of plenty today, at least. My action here is go home. So here's another one overlapping the rest. Production rule for bear near, bail. And notice that there's nothing to do with the sun, nothing to do with berries. If any bear has the status of near me, then I just go home immediately, which is probably a good idea. So all of these production rules can live happily together, where, but obviously they can come into conflict. This is where you would have some cost estimation going on, right? So sun low, few berries, I should stay and gather. Bear is near, I should leave. This is where you would have some computation that says, well, is getting, 10% more berries today worth potential death? Maybe not. So let's zoom in on that conundrum and do a little bit more, pay more attention to utility calculation. The bear rule compared to the others would have extreme utility value, is the way you would kind of phrase this. The others might help you survive in the long run, but this one helps you prevent death today. So it would have a lot of extra value among the possibility space of your production rules. But before we do jump into that, just look at these four. These four define a pretty robust set of behaviors, right? It's during the day I'll go out and I'll go harvest berries, and then at a certain point, based on what has happened, how many berries have I found, or did I run into a bear, I'll make the call. This is a decision, right? So, okay, sometimes though, in production rule world, you end up with conflicting rules. So, bear near bale means when there's a bear and its status is near, I should just go home right now, right? And that's not a bad thought to have, yes? But we could imagine another one where it's a little bit more prescribed, and it's maybe something that we've learned over time. Bear near berry bush is also near. So if we have a bear nearby, but we have a berry bush very nearby. My hunger is extreme, and the sun is like, we have more than 10% of the daylight left. Meaning, if it were lower than 10%, it wouldn't even be triggered. But the idea here is, well, maybe I should sneak in and get some berries. Like there is an opportunity that has presented itself. Now, these can both match at the same time in terms of like, okay, I'm evaluating all my possible production rules, and there's a scenario where there's a bear nearby, and there's a different scenario, same idea as there's another scenario where there's a bear nearby, but there's other information here. So the question is, how would you tease apart which one of these you wanted to use? In production rule world, you do this by computing a utility function. In Act R, that's cast in this way. Utility would equal something like the probability of succeeding at what you're doing times the expected gain from what you're doing minus any perceived costs. So here's the first one, right? Low cost, leaving is not effortful. High probability of success, it's easy to go when you leave. And the gain here, the expected gain, I'm casting it a little funky. I mean, maybe you could cast this as a cost, but it's sort of funny. The gain is a huge departure from the negative, right? I'm not actually gaining anything, but I am avoiding suffering an infinite loss, which is death, right? On the other side, okay, there's a bear nearby, there's a berry bush here, and my hunger is high and the sun is up. There's some moderate cost because it's going to take effort plus like kind of navigating the risk of the bear. So it will be more effortful. It has moderate probability of success. Like the bush is close enough, but I might be chased away or again, killed. And the gain is not bad, right? You get a few more berries before you go home, especially if the berry bush is like particularly ripe. So this, let me go back. Just get rid of that one for a minute. This is the kind of thing where we're back to that core concept of combining disparate pieces of information in some mathematical way. This is a little bit artifice, Act R chose a particular way to model utility functions when the authors of Act R built it. There are other ways you could combine information. We'll even talk about a neurological one near the end here. But yeah, this is the concept. In reality, you'd probably be continuously updating rules, right? Especially if, like, actually the bears in this area don't kind of tangle with you based on experience, right? If you found out that the bears aren't super bothered, you might up the probability of success for one of these production rules. Or maybe I personally got better at harvesting berries. I can lower the costs associated with gathering them. I'm smarter and cleverer. I have better trained hands, and I get better. The point being that these rules would always be in flux and adapting to the environment that you actually live in, yourself, the environment, and anything else that's relevant to your decision-making patterns. Okay, so this is to kind of sum up production rules. They help capture and represent decision-making processes, right? Which is the whole kind of point here. And they integrate multiple sources of information together, which is kind of cool. And they give some kind of action or set of actions to do, and then all in response to the changing and multifaceted state of the world. Back to Act R, modeling is done primarily through production rules. You don't tend to do a whole lot of modeling how memory works for Act R. You're mostly modeling what are the decision rules for this system. And then you throw it into an environment and you watch it behave. And the idea being that when the state of that system changes or the world changes in different ways, it will activate other systems. And that's not a bad way of characterizing you, the person, the human. You can only really behave in response to other things that have happened, right? You don't, I don't know. We don't need to dig into that metaphor too deeply, but yeah. So this is kind of the concept, and a little bit about Act R again. There's like declarative module, which is like long-term memory knowledge stuff. Intentional module, I guess they've renamed recently. That's like for setting your goals. And motor module to interact with the world, blah, blah, blah. And in the middle, you have your production system, which is evaluating rules, picking which ones are good, and then sending off, requests to other chunks of the mind, so to speak here. So let's keep it going. From here, we've discussed production rules, and they're pretty cool. They're letting us define this kind of sparse set of rules for guiding our behavior in a whole host of complex situations. They have this huge benefit of being very flexible and can apply very generally. That bear rule is pretty good at all times. If bear near, leave. Bear near, leave. Good rule. Even if you're playing Tetris, bear near, leave. Yes. So they're very flexible, but they do have that cost, which is the assessing of costs, right? If we have thousands or millions of production rules, the more complex you and your tasks and your situation get, you're going to have more and more of these rules that help you guide your behavior in all possible states. It would start to become really computationally expensive to compare all of those rules to each other. And the stupid example I came up with is, well, I could go to the bank right now, but I'm skydiving. What on earth should I do? Right? You don't want to be weighing 50,000 possibly applicable rules against each other. That's just computationally useless. So this is where the concept of decision trees enters the picture. They're efficient little structures that help us make decisions with less spinning of gears and weighing of options. They're sort of a pre-computed order of decision making to help you figure out how to do things. I characterize them as a crystallized form that good decisions in prescribed situations can take. It's far less general, but it's much more efficient and much more clear. So each node on the tree, we make a decision based on one or two especially relevant variables until we reach the leaf and decide what to do. So to really lay that out for you, my parents are, okay, we're deciding what to do with our weekend, right? Well, the first question is, are my parents visiting? If they are, let's just go to the movies. Just by default. This is what we always do when my parents visit. It always works out. And I'm riffing, but you're maybe starting to see why this would be the structure of the tree. If it's what always works and it's always kind of a good thing, why not? Why not make it the first point and just go for it? But if my parents aren't visiting, okay, well, the next question is, well, what's the weather like today? Well, if it's sunny, we might go play tennis. If it's rainy, we might stay inside. And if it's windy, we have another question. Am I rich or am I poor? If I'm rich, we'll go shopping. If I'm poor, we'll go to the movies. I don't know. None of this makes any goddamn sense in terms of socioeconomic status, but I think I'm hoping you start to see the point of this. You're taking, here's a situation. This is a decision tree for what to do this weekend with my free time or whatever. And it's based on a few different variables. Are my parents visiting? What's the weather like? And how much money do I have? Right? So we have these 3 variables that will partition the space, and like, hey, if this is a yes, we can throw all the rest of the tree away and just, we good. We're done. We reached a leaf and we can go on. So this is the idea behind a decision tree. Now, how do you build them? Well, you can build decision trees by hand, right? But it would be kind of costly and maybe long term, right? You'd have to be doing this sort of casually all the time. You know, oh, I've had dozens of weekends and I've written this chart, this decision tree for myself. But ultimately, that's not a great way of approaching this, because that requires an inordinate amount of like human manual maintenance, and it's also, you know, we're prone to errors. We don't always know the things that are the most useful variables. So, and again, here, pointing here, high risk situations, you don't want to just rely on, well, I think this is the first most important thing that just one random doctor wrote down, right? You would want something that was more evidence-based. So this is where expert systems come in. They're decision trees that are automatically generated from observed data. The math there is a little tricky. It's mostly just like partitioning, variance. Which variables explain the most variance in your outcomes. But the basic idea is, given a data set of situations, so like conditions, like we're talking about with how much money do I have, what time of, or what was it, here, we'll go back, are my parents visiting, what's the weather like, and the money. You can, from just observing that and then just showing like, well, what did we actually do and how good was that, you can do some statistical analysis to assess which of these variables is most relevant to determining outcomes, and you can put that at the top of the tree. So the expert system aims to keep it hyper efficient by putting the most explanatory variables first, and then giving options off of those, and then proceeding to the more and more specific and like esoteric variables as you get further down. So again, this is an automated process. You would take observed data, and using statistical approaches, you can now chop it into these valuable, these crystallized little trees. So using this method, you can consolidate this sort of like wisdom from into these useful decision trees based on historical data, right? So in a medical setting, for example, it comes up a lot. Medical expert systems were a huge innovation, and they're still useful today, right? And it's based on observations, right? We'll get to the medical example in a moment, but this is cool. So first, let's look at, this is a similar situation. So what's the weather like today? If it's sunny, and also then the question is, if it's windy, wait, what's yes? Oh, right, we're playing golf. Okay, so this helps to illustrate. It's an even stupider example than the one before, though. What's the outlook of the forecast for the day? What's the temperature? What's the humidity? And is it windy? Right? These are 4 different variables that you think, well, that might predict whether or not I have historically gone golfing. And so you would say, okay, On rainy days, no. Rainy, no. Rainy, no. And you would do some statistics to say, okay, which one of these is the most predictive of what the outcome will be? And so the first question becomes the rain, right? Because if it's overcast, I'll play golf. Is that accurate? Does that make sense? I guess so. If it's sunny but not windy, I'll go golfing. If it's sunny and windy, I won't go golfing. It's funny that it doesn't include overcast and windy. That happens plenty, etc. I kind of hate this example, but this was the most direct one I could find that shows the transition between we have variables, we have historical observations. Here were the variables, and then here is the outcome. Let's go to something more useful, which is medicine. So the first places these were really applied to great effect was in medical scenarios. And I don't know all these things, but is my ST segment elevated? Yes. Oh, well, then they have high risk. If it's not elevated, then the next question is, well, is chest pain their main symptom? I believe this is risk of heart attack or risk of something similar, a cardiovascular event, right? So if chest pain is not a main symptom, then we can categorize this person as low risk. Again, this is not just built because someone thought it looked nice. It's built on historical data. Because we know that when the ST segment was not elevated for past patients and they didn't have any chest pain, other things weren't even relevant. We just say they're not in a high risk category, which is great to know when you're a doctor or especially an ER nurse trying to figure out what the hell do I do with this random person who's just come in the door, who we've never met in our lives, whose life is in our hands now. Now, used to be, of course, you would just have to be an extremely well-trained person to do all this, but that's not a very fair thing to expect of a primate brain. So crystallizing knowledge in these structures that are data-driven and based on history is a great way to help augment decision-making. It's putting the knowledge out into the world and pooling it from all kinds of sources to get what's the most efficient helper. Now, can it be wrong? Of course it can. But so can every every statistical model you've ever done, every computational model. Every model is wrong. Do you not remember? The question is it useful? And the answer in this scenario is hell yeah. This is great. I don't know what macrolides are, but fever more than 2 days? No, don't give them macrolides. Yes, they've had a fever. Child is older than 3 years. Yes, give them macrolides. If they're not old enough, don't give them it. So and you can imagine what this is based on. This is based on, oh crap, we gave a kid under 3 years old these drugs and they had an adverse response in the past. So that gets in here as this decision criteria is useful. Okay, so I hope that makes it clear. I hope that solidifies the concept here. Let's talk for a moment about human expertise. So we see this progression. We've gone in this video alone. We've gone from basics of understanding state spaces. So what exists? What possible states are there? Building up kind of these general rules for navigating those spaces. So we can kind of leapfrog over finite state machines and into production rules, right? You start to understand the environment and the relationships in it and maybe what you should do. And then finally, we get to this hyper sort of optimized version, these specialized tree structures that help us navigate tasks quickly. That's true in the scenarios we've described in the applications, but as far as I've seen, my PhD was on human expertise. This is a lot to do with how humans actually do it, right? So Fitz and Posner's 3-stage model of human expertise acquisition goes as follows. Don't worry about the tables for a moment. The cognitive declarative step is the first one. And this is where you are gathering knowledge about the task space. You might not know anything about the task that is in front of you, the thing you're trying to do. Long jump, Tetris, chess, whatever the heck, just stuff you're doing. Maybe when you're trying to learn to drive, that's a good one. You are learning, okay, there are levers. there are wheels, there are things I can touch in this car. What do each of them do? And not just what, but also exploring, okay, if I tilt this way, okay, that happens. So this first step is where you have huge gains, but you are bad at it, right? You see rapid gains, the classic like kind of 80-20 rule. You gain 80% of your basic skill set during this 20% stage, right? And they label it verbal motor here because it's thought that you are actually using sort of like remembering things mentally and using your verbal rehearsal loop to do it. But the point is, it's this stage where sort of you are only getting a sense of what exists first. Then we progress to the associative / consolidation stage, which is where you are actually starting to chain together actions, like production rules, based on situations, right? You are learning what you ought to do during different situations in the state space that you have built in step 1, right? So you construct the state space, your understanding of the task, you start to build your rules for interacting in that task, and then finally, the last 20% or last 80% for the 20% gains is the autonomous / tuning stage, which is now you're just about trying to shave, like, what's the fastest way I can figure things out in this environment? No longer are you relying on just like kind of rules of what ought I do. You are trying to build the streamlined version, aka decision trees. Now, again, as always, is there evidence for decision trees in neural structures? Iffy. It's all sort of on the cusp for us. Okay, but you can see here time here means like how long it takes you to do a task. They're associating higher time means like slower reactions and not as good. Lower time means faster reactions and much better. So time versus practice, right? So we have in this first stage, you're in that declarative stage, the cognitive declarative stage. Then you're starting to consolidate things together. And then finally, you are in the fine-tuning stage where you are just streamlining. And honestly, I'll tell you right now, it was putting this lecture together that got me to realize I think this is this whole concept of decision making, from state space to production rules to decision trees. I think that's a realistic pipeline. I might publish something on this in the future. So, new thoughts. Okay. So, another thought though before we leap past human expertise is expertise is fragile too, though. This is the drawback of having built crystallized expertise, like decision tree type things, right? Remember back to the finite state machine of grammar. When in grammar, if you do the dog eats don't, you error out, you fail the tree, and you end up in a state where your very efficient decision tree structure doesn't work anymore. And this is very true. This is true in reality too. So once you wander out of tree in an expert decision structure, it forces you to fall back on more general skills, sometimes falling all the way back to the basics. So the takeaway for you as a human is expertise is great where it applies, these hyper expert structures, right? But try to avoid using decision-making structures that are hyper fit on a single situation to make decisions in other situations. I say Dunning-Kruger here because that's sort of the overconfidence effect, and I think there might be something connected there, right? You may be overconfident because you have expertise in one thing, but it's not necessarily going to apply to something right next door. And a good example of that is Tetris. This is true of world champions and everyone who does Tetris in life, and that is, you can be extremely good at normal Tetris, but the instant I put you into inverted upside down Tetris, even if I keep all the button presses the same, everything else about it, I've just changed the stimulus, people suck. The experts revert back to the same-ish behavior as like novices, but only briefly. Experts can then rebuild and like, oh, I understand this, and I'll rearrange. But for a moment, they are screwed just as bad as anybody, because this stimulus set does not match the behavior and the expected patterns that they're relying on to make their efficient decisions and behavior outcomes. Okay. So one last bit before we bail. Now, as always, we have the question of, well, this is all cool. We're using these abstractions. We're writing things in bubbles and arrows and connecting them. And that's fine. That's cool. Does a brain actually do any of this? And, you know, the question stands. Our brains are made of neurons, and they do decision making. So how does the big wet ball of wires manage to do that? And the answer is that this time around, we have some great evidence that there is a structure, a neurological structure that helps with this. It's called a drift diffusion model. So remember, what do we need to make these decisions? We need the ability to combine sources of information, integrate them over time, and eventually hit a decision where we are sure, like that we should do this or that, right? So the sketch of the drift diffusion model is you got to hold on to some level of activity, right? So you have a neural population and it's kind of just buzzing at a neutral rate, right? It's going to take inputs from other populations responsible for other information. Like for our crossing the street example, well, if my energy level's high, I might try and push this activation towards going, which would maybe be like, oh, active, go, go, go. But if I detected a fast car, maybe from a different source of neurological bundles, like I'm monitoring for a car, that might give us very strong negative, like stop, don't, right? So we have this one decider network that is moving up and down with its activity level and taking inputs from other networks. Well, I'll do an actual description here. I just got excited about describing it. And then once you hit some threshold, either very high or very low, we trigger activation. And that will either have us step off the curb, or it will have us stop and go back to scrolling our phone or whatever. So how do you model this? You can do, so an individual neuron does have some of these properties, right? It takes inputs and it can do some kind of thresholding and produce an output. But it doesn't really have the key element of being able to hold on to some sort of average level of activity. So, I mean, neurons will ramp up and then they'll fire a burst and then they enter a refractory period and they just go inert for a moment. Populations of neurons together, though, they are capable of maintaining some overall average level of activity that can, increase with more of the neurons all firing, or decrease with very few neurons firing. The network population can handle that. So let's do a little walkthrough of this. Left side here, we have a neural population diffuser has some level of activity. So here's the diffuser, and here's its level of activity. Okay. It receives activity input from other networks that do things like the large object movement network, which has a strong negative signal. So if this network becomes more active, it will dampen the diffuser. It'll say, hey, don't. I'm getting huge big car movement energy. Maybe we have one for our personal energy level, like how's my batteries? So if my energy level is higher, I might pass a positive, input over here. And then hunger might give some sort of moderate negative thing, like I'm pretty hungry. I shouldn't, I don't want to be distracted by a hungry tummy if I'm trying to speed across the street. I don't know. I didn't give it that much thought. It's not that important. Point is, you can have three, or you have as many as you need, but you can have disparate other neurological populations that are doing other stuff that send information along to this diffuser, right? So as these other networks start sending input, the activity level is going to change. So, let's see. Right, we're talking here about the threshold. So if the activity level reaches the high end, we'll go for this diffuser. But if it trails off to the low end, we might decide to wait instead. So either way, we're going to send something along to the leg neurons. Either an excitatory input. Now, pause. Super abstracted. I have friends who have seen this and are mad at me about it. They're like, you can't abstract that much. Legs are so much more complex than that. In reality, the point is that something from this network will influence the outcome of your legs either going or not going, right? Tons of complexity and beauty and all important things there. But you should just know that this is an abstraction in the large sense. But either way, the diffuser will somehow impact the leg neurons. It'll either send a, whoa, we need to stop message, or it'll send a, hey, let's boogie. Let's get across the street. So eventually, the activity levels of these things will come and weigh in. So we'll do them in sequence, but let's assume that the energy level is pretty easily available. So that comes right in and says, hey, we could probably make it. Let's go. Then you might realize, oh, I am kind of feeling hungry. Maybe not as much. So sorry, I'm not tracing it. We leapt forward towards the top end, but now we're kind of like dwindling back down. And then finally, oh crap, there's a car. So let's just wait. And that large negative activity shoves the diffuser network down below threshold, and it now decides. It says, no. Hey legs, you ain't going anywhere. Get it? So, just reiterating this whole thing, this is like a chart. This is how you would typically chart this diffuser model. And you have a response threshold at the top of this value. So sort of this is a vertical scroll. These squiggles right here represent the diffuser kind of going up and down with the activity of all the other networks connected to it. Kind of just wiggling. And as information starts coming in from the other networks, it might be pushed further and further up or further and further down. But either way, it's pushed towards one response or another. And eventually it stops, like it triggers something and we get there. So steps here would be see the traffic light, allow a moment for the evidence accumulators to kind of fight it out, right? What is the large object detector saying? What is this saying? What is this saying? And once the response time is modeled by how like difficult the decision is, right? If you have really like, oh, I'm trying to get to work fast. Oh, I'm like so late. Oh, I do see that car though. It will take you longer because you have multiple populations fighting strongly. Like you have an urge to go and an urge to stay, and they're fighting. So it might take you longer. Your response might fall off. Okay, that's enough here. Good paper. Give it a shot. So drift diffusion models, they're this way of doing decision making to be captured at the level of a neural population, right? It's a neurological way of handling it. The population accumulates signal from other neurons until a decision is made. And the question that stands, I guess, is where exactly do these occur in the brain? And in fact, they are super common in sensory and motor systems. Like we've found things that behave this way in like low level vision and motor stuff throughout your body. It's less clear how it might manifest in the central nervous system and in like the brain up here, but either way, it's a shape that neurons can take, and it's super useful. It's a deciding structure. So, oh, and this is just a fun little tidbit. It's thought this is one of the primary mechanisms underscoring ADHD, right? Internal decision diffusers that you're using on your day-to-day life, they might struggle to ever reach any threshold. This is why you enter those like states. If you're one who suffers with ADHD, struggles with it, you'll enter these states where you just can't fire on anything. You can't start anything. And the thought is that you have some sort of difficulty pushing anything over threshold. But this is also why when external deadlines come in, suddenly it's easy to start things, because there's something shoving extra activation over threshold left and right, right? Not to say that external pressure is a fun way to engage with your ADHD, but it's this interesting thought. And, there's tons more research needs to be done here, but I've always found this as an interesting application of this struggle, why it can be difficult to make decisions for some folks. So, finally, we're done. Let's recap. Decisions, rules, and states, a recap. So, given that the world can be chopped up into these state spaces for use in informational systems and by informational entities like ourselves, there's finite states you can leverage of the world, there's continuous states, and there's actions that all kind of make up the phase space. We can characterize our behavior navigating phase spaces as potentially finite state machines for very compulsory or direct information flow, but in more complex scenarios, you bring in production rules for simultaneously considering several states at once, negotiating the complex reality of the real world, and also architectures like ACT-R and SOAR use this same concept. And then also having a way of assessing utility of the possibilities so that you can decide which options might be best for you. And then finally to decision tree, this more streamlined version of decision making where we're using decision trees and expert systems to capture specific crystallized knowledge for good choices, right? Especially in domains that are well known. These are super efficient, but they're not very general. So specialized structures should be used for specialized tasks, but they can be used to great effect. I drew the interesting, connection here that this all very much mirrors human expertise acquisition, and it kind of resembles that process in some interesting ways. And on top of that, we actually have a neural mechanism to describe some of this capacity, right? I can implement these decision-making concepts in neurons. So you can actually explain how neurons can integrate multiple sources of information neurologically. So overall, still a long way to go in understanding how this stuff comes together in the brain. If anybody tells you otherwise, they're crazy. We are not. What's the best way to put it? It's not like we're forever away from understanding these things, but it's hard. The brain is complex. But yeah, the abstractions we've seen here are super useful for building automated systems that can navigate the world and spaces, and for improving our lives with complex and high-risk scenarios like healthcare, and otherwise better communicating, wisdom that we've compiled. Yeah, okay. Took us a minute, but glad we went here. That's it. Take care.